Hello everyone, I've long threatened to make the far future engines by Nertea more realistic, and I think I've come up with a scheme by which I can do so, taking a look at the situation a little bit more closely. The main problem is that given the amount of energy that they don't really require as much radiator capacity as they probably should. So there's two possible solutions. One, require huge radiators, or two, cut down on the thrust. And I've sort of decided to even that out a little bit. In other words, we'll rely on a little bit more radiators and also cut down the thrust a little bit. And the scheme I've come up with is to base the efficiency of that, the thermal efficiency of the engines, on where in the tech tree they lie when it comes to community tech trees. So the ones that are lower down on the tech tree, they are going to be somewhat less efficient, and the ones higher up in the tech tree are going to be more efficient. Simple as that. However, I've hit a few snags, and I'll let you take a look at how this all shakes up. I've made a spreadsheet, and what you'll see is I've got the thrust listed, and the ISPDs are the existing ones, and this is how much power is actually used by the engine. And so here we have 3.6 gigawatts. That ends up being 13 gigawatts, 17 gigawatts. And then this is the waste heat from the engine. And then if you take the waste heat and, if you take the power that is used and then divide by this plus the waste heat, because the waste heat is the part that isn't used, that's the efficiency. So the power plus the waste heat is 1. And the portion of that the power is, the power that's actually being used for the thrust, that's the efficiency. So as you can see, by default, Nertea's far future engines get better than 99.9% efficiency, which is extraordinarily high. There's no easy way to get to that, because just the radiation from the engines is going to lose some, because that's going elsewhere, not out the back always. And then, there's just waste heat on the walls of the engines. So you can have all sorts of magnetic confinement, but not everything can be easily confined unless you're at a really high technology level. If you take a look at even Nervas, or like the pebble bed nuclear systems like the Timberwind, those have about 0.9. The Nerva was like 0.85 or something like that. And they're literally shoving out everything through the back except for a little bit of heat. They don't need radiators because the fuel actually is enough to cool them. So the hydrogen fuel goes through, and that's sufficient at the temperatures that a Nerva or a pebble bed nuclear reactor runs at. Those temperatures, the hydrogen is fine for cooling them. So that's why you don't need radiators for those, or generally speaking. But now we've got higher efficiency. So 0.95 is way above the efficiency of those kinds of systems. And, you would probably need that anyway, but then you need the radiators. So how do I decide how to split between the new waste heat and the new power? Well, I decided to base it on the engine mass. So the heavier that the engine was, the more I assume the user would be willing to carry radiators. So it's just basically 10,000, 10 megawatts per ton of engine mass. So that's how much I've set the waste heat to. So for every ton, it's 10 megawatts. And you can see how that shapes up here based on the engine mass. And then we get a new power. That's how much power it would have. And that's based on the efficiency, this efficiency number here. So you take the waste heat and then you can extrapolate the new amount of power by the efficiency. And then you get a new thrust, because you take the power, divide out the ISP times 9.81, and then you get a new thrust. Well, obviously, they're a lot smaller than the original, aren't they? The Frisbee antimatter is the worst off here. So maybe, I could just type in here and give it the 0.99, and it's still really small because even with 5 digits here, it rounds off to 1. That's how efficient it is. So Anyway, so that's the first question. Generally, I'm telling you about this so that people can decide whether it is a good scheme, because I'm gonna produce RO configurations for this in this way, and I'm going to say that these are, if you're gonna use RP2000, which is basically the only way you can use far future with any career mode, then these are how it's going to be. So, yeah. Now, the Niven nuclear saltwater engine. Well, here's this big snag. This, the fact that we have very little thrust is one snag, and you're going to have to use Pekka's warp thrust mod to get around that. But the bigger snag is that RO actually has configurations for some of these engines, and actually changes one. The Niven nuclear saltwater engine was an engine that was part of Nertea's Far Future mod, but RO changes it to a dusty plasma fission fragment rocket engine. And then it says it's bad, folks. It says it's bad, folks. There. Why did they change it to a bad engine? Well, let's take a look at it. Well, they sort of made it bad for no apparent reason. If you take a look, it has very low thrust compared to everything else. It has very high ISP. It's basically in line with this hammer tong, inertial confinement fusion, okay? But it has way less power usage than everything else. But here's the kicker. Its power that actually goes out the back is far less than the waste heat. So unlike virtually every other engine in the Far Future mod, RO has configured this to have a 13.6% efficiency. I don't know why. Okay? It has far more waste heat than anything else. Now, maybe it's supposed to have that much waste heat and such low efficiency. Great, but it's beyond all the standards of everything else here. So, and RO added it. It's not a default Far Future thing. The default Far Future thing was this one, which has very, very high efficiency, actually. So, I don't know what to do about that. That's problem number one. Problem number one is this dusty plasma fission fragment. Problem number two is RO decided to add these Orion drives. I mean, I've got problems with the Orion drives, but, okay, fine. You like the Orion drives. I get it. Okay. But if we take a look at them in the game, so they're up here. So we have this 12-meter Orion drive. Now, of course, there was a model of it as part of Far Future. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to add it. But they added multiple variants and changed the numbers, okay? And they changed the numbers in a very suspicious way. They have decided that it is okay to have the sea level ISP double the vacuum ISP. And, okay, this, as far as I can tell, comes down to a misunderstanding of how these Orion drives work. The Orion drive charges are directional. They are not just random explosions that go in all directions. Okay? So I think what happens is people think, oh, well, it's a random charge that explodes in all directions, so then it gets sort of reflected by the surface, and then the surface shockwave bounces back. Well, that would only get you some extra mileage early on, but that's not really how the Orion drives work. The Orion drive charges are actually directional. They are shaped charges. So the explosion is sort of blocked in the other directions, prevented from expanding, and they go out in one direction towards the pusher plate, so that the pusher plate gets more of the impulse from the shaped charge. So if you have a charge like that, you of course get better efficiency in vacuum, because along the way, if you've got atmosphere, all the atmosphere is doing is scattering the energy. It'll be a rare atmospheric particle that happens to also decide to go in the same direction as the pusher plate, as the shaped charge wants to have its particles go in. So the shaped charge already wants to go in this direction and not go in the opposite direction. It'll probably explode in the other direction. It's just hindered. So it doesn't have as much impulse in that direction, or as much energy going out in that direction. So it's got much more going in the direction of the pusher plate, because of course that's how you would design it for. And then the atmosphere just gets in the way and slows those particles down. You might get some extra thrust, but all of that extra thrust comes from the existing energy from the explosion, and therefore will only slow the explosion particles down, as far as I can tell. If you think that that's wrong, please tell me. But I think this all comes down to the fact that people don't understand that there are shaped charges involved here. So I'm dubious about those things. They are the mini-mag ones. And another thing is that the Orion drives bear no heat. There is no heat result from that. And to some extent the pusher plate could be thought of as immune to heat. I'm sure there's going to be some heat generated by that, but maybe it's not that much, okay? The mini-mag Orion drive, though, does have a little bit of heat. And it looks like this. It has very little heat, 3 megawatts. And, it's got little fission bombs doing a fission bomb thing, but it's got a magnetic nozzle. And we could work it out. We can work out the efficiency of it, and if we take a look at the handy spreadsheet, that ends up being very high efficiency compared to the other engines as well. So probably it would have more waste heat than just the 3 megawatts. If we even knocked it down to 0.99, I bet you it wouldn't get that much thrust. So yeah. Anyway, that's how I'm thinking of doing this. And so we get new thrusts, we get more requirement for the radiators, but that's why I've been creating radiators, right? Of course, you could scale down the engines to require less radiator capacity, but then you would have less thrust. So that is the rub, but at least the minimum thing I would like to do is in the tech tree, the things that come earlier in the tech tree should have lower efficiency, and the things that come later in the tech tree should have higher efficiency. And I think that's a good way. It shouldn't be the case that everything has the random scatter efficiency, and they shouldn't probably be all that high. But that's the principle I'm working with, and at least for my purposes in the TIPA future history timeline, this aspect of thermal efficiency is the linchpin to organize everything, to make sure that throughout the future history, the not so good engines come first and the better engines come later, except for the fact that we naturally think of fusion being more advanced than fission, and then the antimatter engines being more advanced still, and of course ordering things somewhat by the ISP. But of course, there are the anomalies like the higher thrust engines. If you have a high thrust but somewhat lower ISP engine, that's okay as far as it being a more advanced engine. And that works if you base it on the efficiency instead of basing it off of the ISP. So that was the idea. And if people think that that's a good idea and sort of approve of the numbers, I will just make a new config and release that config. If you guys think that I should up it a little bit, I don't want to go too high on those efficiency numbers, then I'll do that. But it is always the intention that these burns are going to be long, and that you're probably going to do them with some sort of warp thrust mod that allows you to do the burns during higher time warps than the usual phys warp. So with all that being said, that's the proposal. With that, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.